From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon / early evening. It's so great to have you all here. I don't know if, did any of you catch the performance in the afternoon already, or are you here in anticipation of tonight's performance?
Or both performances?
Yeah. Oh, good. Well, my name is David Plylar, and I'm a music specialist at the Library of Congress. And I'm here with two special guests just to talk about a bit about the history of composing for dance at the Library of Congress, but also to talk about what is involved in that process of composing for dance and actually putting together a project like the one that we're all being able to take part of, which is with the Martha Graham Dance Company this weekend, and actually over the past week, which has involved talks about Isamu Noguchi as well as some other aspects of the Graham legacy. So I'm pleased to have with me Aaron Scherber, who is the conductor and music director for these performances with the Martha Graham Dance Company. And he's been leading the way with our musicians. And you won't see him, but he's in the pit doing all the work, so with the musicians. And so he offers a very unique perspective that we'll be able to get. And then also Libby Schmiegel, who is our new dance archivist curator. We're not sure, we just call her the dance person. And she's been a delight to have in the music division, and will offer some perspective from that side. So before we get started, what I thought we could do is maybe just give a little bit of background on who you are. That would be helpful.
I come from traipsing through a lot of different aspects of dance, and I realized I did work with a composer back in my undergrad days, which are hard to remember at this point, where I was choreographing for a production in Greek of the Bacchae and doing that for my senior thesis, and working with a person in the music division who was doing her own senior thesis and was writing for the dancing at the same time, and it didn't ruin our friendship. So there was that. And then I have also gotten a PhD in drama, so I am bringing that to the fore. And my most recent work before coming to the library in August, I headed the Dance Heritage Coalition, which was an association of dance archives and museums and libraries, so that we will be saving better, we hope, dance legacies for all.
I've been with the Martha Graham Company for almost 18 years. 1998 I started, and actually my first performance with the company was here at the library, and it was the first time that we brought back Appalachian Spring since the premiere. So it was that was quite something to step into as my entree into that world. I had no dance experience as a conductor before that, but have gotten plenty in the years since. And along the way, one of the interesting things about my job has been, because of the way the Graham Company is set up, I'm essentially the whole music department. So it's part conductor, part librarian, part archivist, part historian. And it's been just a real thrill for me to come into contact with these pieces and find out what their history is and how all these things come together. And so also nice to be back here at the library.
Well, it's great to have you, and also we'll talk about this later perhaps, but you're doing some editorial work as well, so on some of these pieces. So maybe we'll start with hearing just a sentimental recording.
With much affection, Mrs. Coolidge.
Do you remember Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge?
I certainly do. And with much affection, Mrs. Coolidge really made her mark, I think, on American music in the consistent way over the years. She established and continued to have here in Washington those excellent chamber music concerts. We really owe her a great debt. And I'm very glad you've given me the opportunity to say that in public. I've often thought it, and I wish we had more Mrs. Coolidges around.
That relationship is sort of symbiotic in a way, because just as we, yourself among the many composers, owe a debt to her, I think her memory owes quite a debt to the man who composed Appalachian Spring for her.
You're forgetting Martha Graham, who created the work.
And it didn't even have a title, did it?
No, it didn't. I can't imagine that being true any longer. I'm so used to thinking of it as Appalachian Spring. It never occurred to me that when I was writing it, I didn't know what she had called. She hadn't given it a name yet. So after finishing the work and mailing it back to her, when she already had it in rehearsal, the first time I saw her, I said, "Martha, what have you called the ballet?" I had called it Ballet for Martha, just to, you know, in my own
And
mind.
That's exactly what it says on the front page of the manuscript, Ballet for Martha.
But that was a subtitle. No, I didn't have a title. I was really putting Martha Graham to music. I had seen her dancing so many times. I had a sense of her personality as a creative artist. I had her really in the front of my mind. I wasn't thinking about the Appalachians or even spring, so that I had no title for it. The first thing I said to her when I came down to the rehearsal here in Washington was, "Martha, what have you called the ballet?" She said, "Appalachian Spring." Oh, I said, "What a nice name. Where'd you get it?" She said, "Well, it's the title of a poem by Hart Crane." Oh, I said, "Does the poem have anything to do with the ballet?" She said, "No, I just liked the title and I took it." And over again nowadays, people come up to me after seeing the ballet on the stage and say, "Mr. Copeland, when I see that ballet and when I hear your music, I can just see the Appalachians and feel things." I've begun to see the Appalachians myself a little bit.
I have to add two quick things about that. First of all, Copeland loved telling that story, and he told it almost verbatim multiple times, and I haven't heard the one with the laugh track like that, so that's a new one. But the second interesting thing that I think even Copeland either may not be aware of or glossed over, it's not spring the season, it's spring a body of water in the poem. And very few people are aware of that.
It's not, if I'm not mistaken, it's also not the title.
It's also not the title, I believe.
Yeah, it's.
Yeah, it's in there.
I have a colleague, a retired colleague named Wayne Shirley, who put together this really nice overview of the whole process of commissioning Appalachian Spring and also the other ballets that were, or works that were included on this event in 1944. That kind of goes into this in great detail, covering correspondence and things like that. So he addresses that at one point. You know, but it's as funny as it is, it actually brings up a lot of interesting issues that I think are there from the onset of at the beginning of any great undertaking. And I consider any great undertaking one that requires more than one person, because you have to come to terms with each other in some way if you're going to create some meaningful work of art together. And so even something as that seems as kind of tangential or kind of after the fact is the title of the work, that is the way that we have first access to it in many ways. So it ended up it has a certain resonance with people today that, you know, if it had a terrible title, it wouldn't have helped it. So it was nice that it had this poetic component to it. And one other thing I just want to mention about this, and maybe Aaron, you may be able to speak to this as well, is that he did say that he didn't know what Martha was going to call it. That was the same situation for the Hindemith work, Herodiad, and the Millau work, because they had different titles.
No, the Hindemith did not. The Hindemith, I believe, was, what do you have? You got
Mirror
something?
Before Me?
Mirror Before Me. Oh, you're right.
Yeah.
So it was called Herodiad ultimately because both Hindemith and Graham based their work on the Mallarmé prose poem by that name,
Right.
and I think it just made more sense ultimately. I'd forgotten her before me, yeah. But that, but the naming, that's not unusual that the name comes last.
Sure.
And in fact, the world premiere, the Pontus Lidberg Ballet, didn't have a name about two weeks ago when they had to print it in the program. So that forces things. And the Barber that we're performing, Cave of the Heart, was originally called Serpent Heart when it was premiered. Another Graham Ballet, Diversion of Angels, was originally called Wilderness Stare when it premiered. So sometimes that process of finding a name is, it's the act of summing up what it is you've created, and sometimes it takes a little while for that to settle in.
Well, there's also that, and there's also what the composer might call it on the side versus what the completed work is called. So like in the case of Millot, who had a piece that was also on that, he called it Jeu de Printemps, I think, but it went by the name of Imagined Wing. So I think in his catalog, he kept it as, with the French title, but so there's different, it never quite...
Right, and the Barber piece is called Medea.
Right.
The published ballet is called Medea. On the other hand, I think people do make a little too much about the fact that Copland titled it Ballet for Martha, because really, what else was he going to call it? If you're writing a piece of music and you're writing a ballet for Martha, that's what he put on. I don't think he ever intended that to be a title.
Sure.
But I know in all the Graham programs when we perform it always says, Aaron Copland called it Ballet for Martha, which Martha changed to Appalachian Spring. And personally, I think there's a little too much significance in that.
Sure,
But.
sure.
Yeah, and actually, House of Victory was one of the titles that Martha had settled on in her iterations of sending scenarios to Aaron Copland. And I think it's to his credit he didn't decide to adopt that one right away. But she, has a handwritten, this is a working title. And, I think it sort of still was in the process of being created, and it makes a lot of sense not to settle on something too
Well,
soon.
sure. And, and before we even get to this process of getting created, it's one thing for friends to get together and put together, a work, but it's another if you're talking about professionals coming together and working under contract and having those types of issues that one must think about, especially with these larger works and these, the correspondence and effort that goes into just the business end of putting it together. And I don't mean it in a crass way, meaning like there is a cost to hire 12 performers versus 5 performers. If you only have enough money for 5 performers, chances are the piece will probably only have 5 players. If you have, there's other considerations such as space. For instance, the Coolidge Auditorium, most people know Appalachian Spring and its kind of rich, lush orchestral version, but maybe don't know as much about that original version. And maybe, Aaron, you can say a little bit.
Yeah, well, so I wanted to add, there's a funny letter that Wayne reproduces in there from Eric Hawkins, he was the first husbandman. He was the company manager at Martha Graham at the time and also became Martha's husband for a couple of years. That's a whole other story. But there's a letter that Wayne reproduces in there where Eric is complaining about the fact that Hindemith decided to add a second violin. He said that could wreck our touring budget.
It's true.
Which is yeah, it is very true. The various versions of Appalachian Spring are very difficult. It's a long and tangled story, and in fact, if you read just about any biography of Aaron Copland, they get it wrong. I mean, very bright people who spent a lot of time studying Copland. It's very confusing. So Copland wrote the piece for Martha Graham. It was premiered here at the library. It was a ballet. It was written for 13 instruments: double string quartet plus bass, piano, flute, clarinet, and bassoon. The year after the ballet premiered, Copland made a suite out of it for orchestra. So he took about 6 minutes out of the Simple Gifts variation and a few little nips and tucks here and there and scored it up for full orchestra. And that's the way, I know in my parents' generation, that's how everybody knew it, the orchestra suite. It was hugely popular in the 40s and 50s and through the 60s, and even today is one of his most often performed pieces. There are a couple of reasons why people are less familiar with the 13-instrument version. One is, while Martha was alive, she died in 1991, Copland stipulated that nobody but Martha could play the ballet version.
Oh.
And there's a funny story behind that, which is when she died, and Boozy and Hawkes, who was her publisher, said, great, not great, but now we can rent this out and make some money off of it. They realized they didn't even have parts to it. And they called up the Graham Company and said, I know you have parts which you paid for and made, but technically they're our property because they hold the copyright, so they consider them to be on permanent loan. So they said, send us a set of your parts so we can make a copy of them. And to this day, if you rent the ballet from Boozy, you get a really bad Xerox of our parts, because so that's changing. But Copland himself, for a long time preferred the orchestral version, and if you listen to it, I mean, it sounds a lot like the other stuff he was doing at that time. It sounds like Rodeo and Billy the Kid. It's very much of that time period and the same use of the orchestra. It wasn't until the late 60s that some friends of his convinced him that people wanted to hear at least the chamber orchestration, that it had value of its own. And so in 1972, what he did was he took the edits he'd made to make the orchestral suite, he made the same edits to the ballet so that you now have a 13-instrument suite. So the same musical material as the orchestral version, but the original orchestration. And then for a couple decades, a lot of people grew up doing it that way. As a young conductor, we all know the 13-instrument Appalachian Spring Suite because it's on every audition. When you're putting together an audition tape to go to graduate school, 13 players is really easy to get together. So every young conductor in my day, grows up knowing that suite. And in the ballet version, hearing that extra music, and some of you heard this afternoon, others will hear it tonight, but there's about 6 minutes in the middle of Simple Gifts where you go, where did that come from? I have never heard that music before. Is that even Copland? But it gets very complicated because there were other versions of things. Copland orchestrated some, but not all, of the missing music in the 1950s. And some conductors like to put a big insert into the suite, and then some people like to put the same insert into the 13-instrument suite. There's a version that Boozy has been publishing which they say is complete, which isn't really complete. It's a long story, but we're in the process of rectifying that, and maybe I'll get to that later.
Oh, sure. Well, in addition to these issues that have to do with instrumentation, there are, of course, the production costs and thoughts, that have to do with the creation of a large dance work. And maybe, Olivia, you can speak to that a little, or just about what types of things people have to think about when they're putting together these things.
Well, I think in the initial even conversations between the composer and the choreographer, to find that place of working together is essential. And I am still in awe of some of the examples we have where they're carrying this correspondence on by mail across an ocean. And I think about in the Library of Congress materials, we have a collection of correspondence between Ruth Page, who was sort of a Ballet Russe generation Chicago dancer choreographer who was really interested in getting herself on the map. It's a very interesting piece in itself, this small correspondence, with a composer named Remy Gassman, who was interested in working with her, but he was living in Strasbourg at a time when she was trying to get this group together, even getting a rehearsal piano score she couldn't do to try this out. And it seemed to end up being a correspondence about composers that can't meet deadlines, which of course we have with the Martha Graham as well, because we have the problem with the Dark Meadow. And again, Carlos Chavez was in Mexico, busy being a conductor now of a major symphony, and even though he had a great track record of having composed just myriad pieces, it just seemed as though this wasn't going to come to the finish line. And there is some interesting correspondence in the Spivak collection at the Library of Congress where finally he's pulling the plug saying we have to get Darius Milhaud because he meets a deadline. And so artistic concerns at that point are going out the window because you've got a fixed deadline for putting on a show. And I don't know that, clearly the Appalachian Spring example is a better model, and even Aaron Copland couldn't meet the initial deadline because the debut was about a year late, I think, from what they thought.
This is speaking from experience, this is a very common thing for composers to be late on these types of things. So I don't. While we talk about Chavez not being able to get it done, I can kind of understand a little bit.
Copeland said it was par for the course for Chavez.
Oh well,
Yeah.
well, sure.
That he was frequently late and incommunicado. So.
Yeah, well, and then you have people like Mio who did have the reputation of just writing so prolifically and easily, and he did. He actually produced it so quickly that it was no problem.
You talk about the mechanics of all of this, and I'll add two things to sort of bracket this discussion. So what we're talking about, this period, particularly in the 40s with Martha Graham, as she was working with better-known composers, the way she worked, as David indicated, was to send this scenario description of the dance, and the composer would work from that and then send the dance back. Previously, so one of the great things about the Martha Graham Dance Company is that from about 1935 until 1975, I think all but 3 of Martha's new dances used commissioned music, new music, and almost all new American music. It's a really unmatched record of support for American contemporary composers. And so from my point of view, that's a wonderful thing to work with. The way she started in 1935 with commissioned music was her music director, Louis Horst, who was a very influential figure in not only modern dance music, but modern dance as well. If you go back to Graham's mentors, Ruth St. Dennis and Ted Shawn, and other people like Isadora Duncan, turn of the century modern dance, the way they made a dance was they'd find something nice by Satie that has some faux Orientalism, and they'd add some scarves and some incense, and they would decorate the music, and that was their idea. I'm simplifying a bit, but they would decorate the music, and Horst was one of the first people to say, yeah, if you want to be taken seriously, if you want this modern dance to be taken seriously, the choreographer's ideas have to come first, and you can't go find existing music and fit your ideas to it. You have to have your ideas, and the music will fit it like a frame. And so from 1935 until about 1940-41, a lot of people who wrote scores for Graham were friends of Louis, who would come in and work with Graham in the studio, so that while she was improvising movement phrases, they would be improvising at the piano and finding things that fit. And then when she had the final shape for her dance, then the composer would find the final shape. Now that falls apart in the 40s because Aaron Copland isn't going to sit in the studio for weeks on end while Graham improvises. And the other thing to bracket that, though, with all this long distance and the correspondence, Martha Graham was doing a pair of pieces, one called Saraband and one called Deep Song, and the composer was Henry Cowell. Graham and Louis Horst at the time were working at Bennington, I think? Was it Bennington or was it Connecticut? I forget. They were somewhere up in New England. And Henry Cowell was in California, and not only was he in California, he was in prison in California. He was in San Quentin, and still wanted to fulfill the commission. Have you heard this?
No, this is fascinating.
So Horst and Graham flew out to California to meet him, and in San Quentin, Martha Graham demonstrates some of what she has in mind for the dance, and talks to him about what her ideas are and how this all works, and then they leave. And what Cowell does is he, a while later, sends back east a packet of music, a series of, I think, 13 or 14 melodic fragments and 8 or 9 percussion fragments to join them. And he says, I wrote these in the style of what you showed me. Now that you know what the finished dance is, you should arrange them the way you want them and put them in the order that matches what Martha did. And they did it, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's the extreme of not being in the same place.
Well, speaking to that relationship, it's amazing that there they had an identified relationship that worked well. One thing I want to mention before we kind of shift back to 1944 through 46 and beyond is just the library's earliest commission, dance-related commission, and I'm kind of counting them as dance-related if there was a component that came out of it, and that would be Apollon Musicet, Stravinsky. And Adolf Bohm was the original choreographer and dancer who was involved in this. It's a bit of a strange story in that his choreography is not the one that is known for that work. In fact, it was Balanchine, I think, whose choreography, and also renamed it as Apollo, that became the way that we know that work that was originated here and performed here. But that's kind of a case where somewhere in that process, something, and I don't know the full story, so I'm not sure how that happened, but something went awry. And
So anyone who wants to look at a research topic that would be publishable, this sounds like one.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But that's interesting too, because it was Ruth Page who later was, ascending as a Chicago-based dancer, and Adolphe Bohm also was Chicago-based. And I've sort of wondered, whether just their location, when dance as a center in New York seemed to be so important, that, the ones on the sort of edges, because San Francisco had its stars too, which we just don't know as much about. So there are lots of things to consider, but that's a really good question.
Well, that also, speaking of, that same thought was actually articulated by Dakin Hart at the Noguchi lecture just the other night. He used images of these costumes that Noguchi had designed for Page. But felt that, again, that part of her regionalism was part of the reason that she wasn't able to take off. But anyway, that's a bit of an aside. But okay, but going back to maybe this, just looking a bit more at this process of creation, the notion of a scenario and what that tells a composer is an interesting one to me, because that does not strike me as terribly specific in terms of what kind of information is being conveyed.
Well, then you didn't look at the scenarios that Graham sent Copeland.
Well, maybe you can speak to that a bit.
Well, she started out with some curious ideas that might not be seemingly a hit now. There was a speaking character, a Native American that she had. It was much more episodic. So, for example, there was an episode of John Brown's uprising at Harper's Ferry. There was a lot. It could have been, a 3-hour melodrama. And, Copeland would write back and go, well, this is an interesting part, and kind of give her feedback, and she'd do another iteration and kind of move it along. In fact, I think she tried out the Medea idea as well with him.
Right,
And
before
he
they
was
got
like,
the House of
"That's-"
Victory.
Exactly.
She was very interested in Medea.
In Medea.
But
And he said, that's really not me. That's not a good fit for
she sent
me."
him Medea in New England.
Mhm.
So it wasn't quite the
Yes.
Medea that we get with Barbara.
No, not at all. But at any rate, she sort of would try out these ideas, and I am a believer that whether you're writing or choreographing, a good editor, one that you trust, is a great thing to have. And I think this is where we see a really sort of a trustworthy relationship, where she was getting back frank but very helpful feedback, and that played to both of their strengths ultimately.
Please.
But the end to that, though, is, first of all, if you look at the last script that she sent him and you sit there with the score, you can go through almost line by line and see what Copeland was doing. Copeland, at this point, he was doing North Star out in Hollywood. He was doing film scores. And so he was basically scoring the final scenario that Graham sent him. And then what's really interesting, not only did Copeland not know the name of the ballet until he got down here, he didn't even see it. He had seen nothing of the ballet until the dress rehearsal the night before it opened. And what he didn't know was, when Graham got the score back, it took her in different directions. And so things that she had described in great detail to Copeland, she decided to do something totally different with that music. He was okay with that, though.
I think that your mentioning of film scoring, though, is an important one just to bear in mind in terms of that level of trust that one must have at some point in terms of one's ability to realize either something that is scripted or a scenario that is suggested versus the types of demands that he was becoming used to in terms of the meaning how you literally deal with time and use those as constraints as opposed to necessarily things that could be a bit more loose in terms of those timings. That's for composers, especially of, say, chamber music composers, time is an issue, but it's not something that is so much something that is prescribed from on high, unless your commissioning agreement says, that you have to have a 23-minute work. But of course, that never works out anyway. But composers respond very differently when they're collaborating with with others, or if they're working on a film score. So it's just something to bear in mind, that it's a different type of way of thinking about it, and some people are able to rise to that challenge, while others don't, and we usually don't hear about those who don't, so that's okay.
Well, but that's Carlos Chavez, right?
Well, there
I
you
mean,
go. Yeah,
Graham sent him this scenario, and when she finally got the music back late, she listened to it and said, this has nothing to do with what I sent him. I can't possibly dance that dance. And so she had to make up something completely different to go with that music.
Speaking to that, this kind of shows it. I have a review from the premiere of the Chavez here that I pulled out. This is not an advocation of the content of it, but just rather to show what some of the issues were. It says basically. Let's see, I'm sorry. The work was commissioned for the Elizabeth Sprague Coolidge Foundation's festival at the Library of Congress in 1944, but Carlos Chavez did not complete the musical score in time. So this is common knowledge, apparently, at this point. Whether or not he has yet completed it would be difficult to answer from last night's presentation. It is utterly without theatrical or choreographic quality, pure paper and ink music, and long stretches of it sound like so many pages out of Czerny. That's a bit, I don't feel that way about Czerny either. Like it's he's much maligned. But sorry, the part I wanted to get to is that Miss Graham has been able to make a dance composition against it is inexplicable. Its rhythmic plan and its phrasing are tenuous in the extreme, but she has justified them by the almost constant employment of a free choreographic counterpoint, which not only avoids a totally static stage, but actually creates a certain excitement. What she has done is a miracle of sheer invention, but invention not on an intellectual plane, but on the subjective level of pure intuition. So it's kind of an interesting thing that there was a sense of disjunction or something like that that was perceived at that time, but still an appreciation for what that final product still ended up being. So there you have that. So one other, let's see, I think that I'll come back and mention a few more of the other commissions that have been done, but I think one thing that would be interesting to hear both of you talk about a bit more is, okay, let's say that there's this agreement between choreographer and composer and things are moving along, and you get to a point, we'll even kind of gloss over the stages of piano score versus having a full score if it's differently orchestrated. What about the process of rehearsal and putting it together? Maybe you can speak about some of the challenges that are maybe unique to dance and realizing these types of new projects.
Well, from my standpoint, what I'm also seeing is that a lot of people now are using recorded music, and dancers almost get a sense of even what the spaces are between those pauses. And it becomes very organic. And there's something lost, I think, in terms of the sort of performative presence of really being able to commune with the accompaniment, which isn't to say that they aren't wonderful, because oftentimes they can't afford anything but recorded music. But, you know, I think we all even know on our little iPhones, you know, that we can even know how much space it is before our next favorite song kicks in, what that time is. We get to know that, and it becomes then maybe more mechanical. And a number of choreographers, such as Mark Morris, who likes to perform with the live music and tours usually with his own group if he can, is that he has them record many different versions and just pops these in as a surprise. So, you know, tonight we're using this one. And so they get that sense that it's still the same orchestration, it's the same set of musicians, but that human thing of, you know, never being able to do it exactly the same a second time means that they have to be listening. And he really does respect the musicality of dancers, and that's what he's also looking for when he's even choosing his dancers. But, you know, then we have Merce Cunningham, who works completely against that in the sense that he doesn't let the dancers do rehearse to a sort of mechanical, stopwatch-driven time, and that music is going to come, or accompaniment, or sound score, whatever it is that Merce Cunningham would have commissioned, that was made separately from the dance and would be imposed at the same time for the dress rehearsal. And then he's hoping that that internal ability to move and to hear it within yourself, irrespective of what's happening on the outside or the coughs in the audience, that it's going to be the same. And so he's actually going for something that's replicable, which is an interesting, very different aesthetic.
Well, that's interesting. So, two things. First of all, I was grinning when you told the story about Mark Morris. I hadn't heard that story, but that's been my dream for years. See, I mean, seriously, because the Martha Graham Company, we perform with orchestra whenever we can, but it hasn't been nearly as much as when I started. And a lot of that has to do with money, and they've got recordings, and it goes that way. And I've always thought, recordings wouldn't be so bad if you had a few different ones and could switch them up. So I think it's incredible to hear that. The other thing with Merce, though, is Merce, I think, is creating the conditions for the audience to have an artistic experience. So for him, in my understanding, the dance and the music happen simultaneously, but don't really relate, other than the fact that they may stop and start and stop at the same time. And for him, you're right. I mean, I've seen those dancers rehearsed with the timings and with all that, so that they could do that repeatedly. And I think what's interesting for him is how the audience perceives that interaction then of those two artistic things happening simultaneously, but not really interacting.
One question about that is there, so say in an early work of this nature, was there foreknowledge given to an audience member, or would of this sense of lack of intended interactivity versus whether they're actually, whether that coincides with what they're actually experiencing?
When he started doing that, it was clear that he and the designer and the composer would get together and they would talk about what is the concept. So there would be a concept and an agreed, and oftentimes the title can give it away. You've got birds, you've got island, you've got points in space, and you do see that there are evocative parts when you hear the sound score or you see the costumes as well as the whatever creature movements that he has. But I do think it asks something different. You're right, of the audience, that it is a different kind of aesthetic experience, and it requires a different kind of dancer. Because you almost have to train relational phrasing out of you. It has to come just from the body to body in space, and not, what you're hearing.
But from the standpoint of an audience member, those relationships, I think, are constructed in the process of experiencing the work, for whatever that's worth, and it might just be, that's an...
Right, but and I think that's what he was going for. I had a long discussion about this with Beverly Emmons, wonderful lighting designer for dance, who worked with Cunningham and also has worked with the Graham Company. But she said some wonderful things that I'd never considered in exactly this vein. And her opinion was that Merce wanted the art to happen in the audience. He's setting up these conditions, the interaction of the dance and the music and the lighting, and whether he rolled the I Ching to get something that night or whatever. No, because he did that. Oh, yeah. Right. I mean, sometimes they pick, costumes or light plots depending on a roll of the dice for that evening. But what Beverly said, which made a lot of sense to me, was that he was about then the audience being able to perceive that interaction in real time, to see those bits coming together in ways that they may never have come together before and may never again. So locating the artistic experience, the audience is not just receiving the performance, but in some sense the performance is happening in the audience, that artistic experience.
Well, this is
That's
all.
what Beverly says anyway.
This is all maybe bringing it back to a case where, like, say, in Appalachian Spring, where the coordination is fairly clear. What are some of the challenges that, again, now that you've been doing it for so many years and have that experience, it's probably not as challenging as it was when you first started, but maybe you can speak to some of those things, because there's the practical nature of being able to coordinate between the musicians that you're directing and what's happening on stage.
Right, and well, so there are several aspects of that, and some of it, I mean, following on what was said before about live music and sort of some of the uncertainties that that introduces. First of all, I mean, we're so grateful to any presenter in the library to be able to have live music. I'm always reminded, Joan Acasella, who writes about dance for The New Yorker, in some wonderful articles, she said, and I think this is true, dancers move about twice as interestingly to live music. And she said we can become used to canned music the way that we become used to smog instead of air, and we get used to spam instead of ham. But that when you suddenly have the real thing, it reminds you what you've been missing. That happened to have been a review of some Martha Graham performances that didn't mention me at all, but it's still my favorite review I was ever involved in, because I think that's so true what she said. And following on that, and following on this idea of interaction, when I first started in '98, the dancers I was working with for the first couple of years, it was a very interesting mix of fairly new dancers to the company and some dancers who'd been there for a long time. When I was here in 1998, I mean, Christine Dakin and Therese Capucilli were my brides. Janet Elber was the pioneering woman in her last performance with the company. So there was some of that going on. And then there were, younger kids who'd just joined. The younger kids all came up to me saying, "Are you taking the same tempos that are on the recording? Are you following the recording?" They were very worried about this. I said, "Well, yeah, I'll try to." And Therese and Christine said, as long as what you do is musical, we'll dance to it. And they, as performers, craved that difference. They didn't want it the same. They didn't want it predictable. They wanted it in that range, right? Something is too slow and something is too fast. But there's a range in there of things. And so even this afternoon, those of you who saw the performance, the first bride solo, beep, bop, beep, bum, bop, 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 bum, beep, bop, bop. I was a little slow today. I didn't get the tempo quite where I wanted it. And the dancer in that, for those 2 minutes, has to find a way to make those tempos work and not just rely on, I know it's this step and this step and this step, but how do I stretch this a little? How do I give this a little more weight to fit with what I'm hearing? And not that I consciously try to surprise them in that way, but but we're not automatons. Every performance I do is slightly different. I think I have a very good sense now with most of these dances about what that range is. Sometimes I like a side of that range that's a bit different from where the recording is that they're used to, and that's something that they've gotten used to with me over the years. This is going to be a little different with orchestra, but it is that process, and things are different, and things happen on stage. So we had a discussion, this is a small example, just about timing and things. If you were at the performance this afternoon, you noticed that after the big Medea's Dance of Vengeance, which is the big stormy center of that Barber piece, and she runs off stage, there's a big boom in the orchestra, and we got applause. Now that almost always happens when we do it with live music, not necessarily with tape, but I had to warn, there's still a dancer on stage, and the dance continues. So I said to the woman dancing the chorus, I said, because we haven't done this before, I said, if there's applause, just wait. I'm going to wait for you. You wait till the applause to die, and I'm not going to go on till I see you start to move. Because with the recording, she's got to go on. You can't pause the recording there. So even just little things like that, things about working together, things about knowing what I'm looking for to pick up a tempo or to cue the beginning of a section, they're things that develop over time.
Sure. Well, one thing I wanted to make sure that I mentioned is that the three performances that you're hearing include the world premiere last night of a new choreography that was commissioned by the Irving and Verna Fine Fund in the Library of Congress with the Martha Graham Dance Company and by Pontus Ledberg. And that he was here last night.
He was here today.
Yeah. Oh, he's here. Oh, great. So When it's in this case, it's using the music of Irving Fine. Some slight changes in terms of order, but not in terms of substance or that much. So there is a sense of reference that you had as opposed to a newly commissioned work. But in terms of how it came together, was there a difference with a new work for the Martha Graham Dance Company? Was there a difference between that versus one of the repertory works?
A longer rehearsal period for the dancers, and we certainly try. I mean, we've commissioned a number of works since Graham died, and we try to give the choreographer all the time he needs, which can be quite a bit. And for the last several weeks, he was working generally 3 hours a day with the dancers to do this. And even as recently as last week, when I went to New York to watch some of it, the dance was not complete, and that's not unusual either for things to come together very last minute.
Well, I thought for now we could actually take some questions, if that's good. And if you could wait until a microphone comes to you, it'll be on its way.
Thank you. Hi. My question actually isn't about the music, it's about the costumes. And I'm curious what happened to the original costumes and any stories about reproducing them, and in particular the fabric, that these long dresses that flow so beautifully, in which Martha Graham loved the image of. So I thought, Olivia, you may know, or you may know something about the costume and the fabrics.
I think probably you know more about the costumes. And
Right, so Graham designed most of the costumes for most of her dances, at least till the later years. And if you talk to our costumers, she was actually very ahead of her time in the way she used fabrics and the way she cut and sewed them to get certain types of movement out of the fabrics. And so obviously we've reproduced a lot of these costumes many times in the intervening decades, and it's always a challenge to find, because often the material she used isn't made anymore. And so to try to find something that's similar and will react a similar way when it's cut and bound a certain way. You asked about the original costume, so if you've seen, I think there are pictures out here of the premiere, right? The costumes that Graham used at the premiere of Appalachian Spring are not quite the same ones that we dance with nowadays. I think they were changed a few years after the premiere, and it was something that Graham just decided to change. And even today there are a couple of variations on the bride's costume. The young woman this afternoon wore a lavender one. The one tonight's wearing peach. There's a third one I've seen recently. I can't think what it was, but those are the peach is more common nowadays. Graham's original dress was more of a gingham kind of thing. You can see it in the photos. And I'm not sure why she changed it, but the peach and the lavender are constructed very much the same way. The Pioneer Woman's costume is very different. It was very severe in 1944, black with a bonnet and very sort of scarlet letter foreboding. And now it's a bit more of a flowing kind of thing. But yeah, we reproduce the set pieces. This is a brand new copy of the Appalachian Spring set. So we have. Well, the originals, there are often two originals for the sets. So often Noguchi would have made a sculptural version that the Noguchi Foundation has in their home on Long Island. And then there would have been whatever the first set was that was made for the Graham Company. We still have some of those. They haven't been tremendously preserved. But I'll tell you, with the sets and the costumes, a few years ago when Superstorm Sandy hit New York, we had just moved into some new studios down on the lower west side of New York, and our basement was flooded. And a lot of stuff was just lost. It was waterlogged. I mean, millions of dollars of damage. Some originals, old prints, photographs and things, and old costumes, and old original set pieces that Martha had danced with, and a lot of that was just lost. And it's been a slow process to get some of that back.
But I don't think that it's unreasonable to think that these things should survive 100 years. Mm-hmm. They're touring, they're putting them up in new places and having to adapt to, not every Appalachian Spring stage is the size of the Coolidge.
None of them is the size of the Coolidge.
Exactly. And so, you're having to adapt all the time. And the dancers also, Martha is the same size, but you get new dancers.
She's
and
a little smaller now.
But, you know, the new dancers come in, the costume, you're not going to cast according to who can fit this costume. So you often have to make a new set because the dancers from the 1950s are a little different sized than the 1940s.
Another thing that Janet Eilberg mentioned last night was that one thing to point out is that the sets are being used all the time, so that the
They
dancers
get
are
worn.
interacting with them. So there's actually a wear and tear factor.
Yeah, I'd like to go back to the collaboration issue because to me that it's so interesting to look at the different ways that collaborations can come together. And of course, you know, funding money is always an issue for anyone in the arts, whether you're talking dance, music, some other kind of art. Funding is always an issue. My background is from the dance side. And we did various projects that started from different places. I mean, sometimes it would start with the choreographer. Sometimes it would start with the music, and then we'd work with the composer or someone arranging the music. We even did projects where we had a playwright who would write a play, and then the dancers would learn the words, and then the composer would come in after that. So could you, Aaron I'm speaking to mostly because he's the experienced one here, could you comment on, like from a composer's or conductor's, composer David also, what would be your preference? Like how much direction do you want at the outset before you start working?
Well, so from a conductor's point of view, whether I'm working with an existing score or a new score, I want to have as much information as possible about what's in. My job as a dance conductor is to support the dance. I love the fact that I'm down there in the pit and no one can see me, and it's all about providing that lift to the dancers so that you all in the audience can enjoy it. So what makes my life easier is knowing as much as knowing a brain dump from the choreographer. What's on his mind? What are his influences? What is he hearing in the music that I should try to go for as well? And I've done a few premieres with the Graham Company, even with varying degrees of that kind of interaction. I had generally a little less interaction with Pontus on this dance. We corresponded early on as he was trying to figure out which Irving Fine pieces he wanted to use. So I sent him some thoughts about some of the ones that he was looking at, just again from my point of view, information for him to use. And I went up last week to watch some rehearsals, but even then he seemed hesitant to tell me too much. Maybe that's his way of handling that working relationship. And he kind of gave me some images about what was going on, but he was very hesitant to describe a through line to the dance or to give it a plot. So I'm working with little snippets of things I hear and trying to do what I think will support what he needs.
Speaking a little bit to the on the compositional side of things, I would just say this, that every project I think has a different set of rules to it, and they kind of come into play as you develop the project, and it depends on how people interact. But one of the challenges I think that, in this case with a dancer and a choreographer, or sorry, with a choreographer and a composer being involved, is that composition, at least some types of composition, tend to be more of a solitary endeavor when it comes to the actual production of the work, while there's a bit more of a social component to the choreographic one, where you're working with the dancers and having that. And so there really does have to be some sort of a coming to terms with each other, and that just all depends on the nature of the project. And I know that people who have frequent collaborations, well, it might be that they work out a pattern of how they work, but oftentimes each project demands different types of ways of collaborating. So that would be just one thing to throw out about that. We have one here in the middle.
Who's gonna
Go ahead. Go ahead, Nan.
Okay. I'm just curious about how the company has changed over the years as the world has changed in terms of its approach to choreography.
One of my least favorite things about the reviews that we often get, and I'd love to hear your perspective on this historically, a lot of our reviews say, boy, everything was great and I had a great time, but boy, is that Graham choreography dated. That is my personal pet peeve, because it is absolutely true that I don't think there are any choreographers working today, working in the style of Graham, whether you're talking about the specific movements or whether you're talking about her sense of theater. It's a very overtly dramatic style. It's a very narrative style in most cases. That it's very hard on your sleeve style that I think is just not very au courant, and that's very true. But nobody's writing the same way Beethoven wrote. We don't call his music dated. The ballet steps have been around for how long? And we don't say, well, I was in Balanchine, but boy, does that look dated.
Or plays. Same thing with plays. It's
Right.
what you're doing with them rather than.
Right.
Is there
So-
is there a conversation about that topic within the troupe or the company?
Yes. I think there's a real belief in the company, and I believe this too, that we don't want to perform the pieces the way they were performed in 1944. We have to take these pieces and relate them to a contemporary audience. So yes, these dances were made up 50 years ago, and yes, it's a very different kind of storytelling that we have to honor the spirit of that. We don't want to change what Martha did. But at the same time, we're performing it in the year 2016 for an audience that has seen decades worth of stuff in the interim. And but it's, to me, that's not an unusual thing. It's the same challenge that, for example, an orchestra faces playing Beethoven or playing Copland or playing Debussy. You don't play it the way you did back then. You take some lessons from back then. You're presenting a style, but you kind of have that, one foot in both camps. But at the same time, so as we've done commissions since Graham's death, there has been a very active discussion about what kind of choreographers to work with to extend that legacy. Are we looking for choreographers who are consciously working in something related to Graham's style in some way? Or are we looking for just good choreographers? And different leaders of the company have had different viewpoints on that sort of thing. But there's very much a sense, and I know this is something Janet thinks a lot about, is how to invigorate these works and make them not seem like museum pieces and make them really just speak to you. In a certain sense, as a performer or as an audience member, if I'm watching something, I don't care how old it is. I don't care when it was written. I mean, that's all interesting. But what I care is, does it move me?
Also, I think dance people, when they are reviving an older work, they often talk about reconstruction, which is possibly the least creative sort of word to use. And instead of finding the life that's within that piece that made it iconic to start with, they're sort of thinking about where the feet were, instead of going, how do we get the people to embody the intention of this work? I mean, the emotions, the ideals of an Appalachian Spring, of a Cave of the Heart, are as fresh today as they were 1,000 years ago when on the Greek myths. And these, people get angry, they're jealous, they're, delighted when they're married, they're in love. These are not new things. So how do you take the way that choreographer or the playwright or the person writing music or any of those, or the opera, and make it new for, do what Yo-Yo Ma did for Bach and a 21st century audience, that made it something that Americans got excited about. And, so I think that we have to rethink that. We have Revelations, we have Appalachian Spring. I would say those are two major American iconic dances. And, why do we're reviving Broadway. Guys and Dolls, that seems dated to me. And yet we find...
great.
Well, it's great. It's great stuff, but it's still, a lot of the lyrics and stuff, to me, seem dated in a 21st century. It's still fun to go and see. And so the challenge for us is to find similar ways to revive, restage, reimagine dance that has been really important to us so that we can experience it again. And I have to say, I think what Janet and you are doing, I've seen Appalachian Spring a lot. I've seen, I'm not young. And I think this was one of the most delightfully fresh, exciting productions that I can remember of Appalachian Spring. So you're to be commended, and Janet as well.
Well, so, I mean, and it's very interesting. This gets to the historical point as well, and gets to what we were saying about costumes and different dancers and things. There are always different dancers coming into these roles, right? Now, one thing, so when I started with the company, the brides I was working with were Therese Capucilli and Christine Dakin, who were two of the senior dancers in the Graham world. They'd been there since the late 70s, I think. And they brought such a wealth of experience to that role that I got to learn from working with them. And then I worked with another bride, Virginie Messine, who was also a senior dancer in the company. And then about 10, 12 years ago, a young dancer named Blakely White McGuire took on the role. And it was a revelation for me because she was 25 and she wasn't 40. And she was, I mean, Graham was 50 when the dance was premiered.
Yeah.
But suddenly I was seeing things just because she was younger and fresher. It was a whole different bride. And I started hearing her music in a whole different way and trying to bring something different. And if you see these performances today, both brides are very young. I think the one tonight's even a little younger than the one this afternoon. But these both wonderful dancers, fresh-faced young girls who are bringing a whole different dramatic perspective to that role that changes. So, you know, some of what you were saying about the immediacy of that, what you're seeing is some of that. You're not seeing the most seasoned Graham technique-laden performance, perhaps, but you're seeing two young performers who are in love with what they're doing and who sell that character of the bride in tremendous ways. So that's part of all of this also, as the different dancers come in and put their stamp on the role.
And I think we have to see, too, that training has changed. So what was really exciting as the technique was developing in the 30s and the 40s, then we went through sort of a period of anybody can be a dancer, and now we are, you know, everyone who's a dancer has to be able to hold their leg up here because so you can be on so you think you can dance. And what we sort of lost was some of the empathy. So the technique, the ability to do certain things, I mean, it's physically off the charts, as the Olympic competitions are as well. Physical training has, you know, just done amazing things. But then that interpretive capacity that really together, now this is me talking, not the library or Erin or anybody else, but I mean, I see virtuosity as being some kind of a combination between technique and interpretation. And that means you could even have a masterwork. You know, you see it in opera a lot of times, but there are certain people that have extraordinary empathy with that and bring it to bear. And that's kind of what, you know, that's why we keep going to an Appalachian Spring or a Swan Lake and we see or a Revelations. You know, I don't get tired of that one either. You know, and you kind of look for what the new cast is bringing to it. You see them develop into it as they make it their own. And that's the part that's exciting, and we need better critics.
Yes.
That can see those things, but they're all on blogs, so we can't save them. So, you know, I don't know what we'll have. That's the archivist talking and wringing her hands.
And they need to write that down so that we can keep a record of those things too, because that's always an interesting thing to be able to look back at as well. Maybe we have time for just one more question. We can also get her. We can do two. We could.
When a commissioning process starts, does it usually start with they select a composer and then they select a choreographer, or vice versa, or is there any pattern, or how does that work?
That depends very much on, we can speak to it in different ways, but it depends very much on what institution is initiating that, or if it's coming from a artist suggestion sort of thing.
Well, the initial letters from Mrs. Coolidge to Eric Hawkins, who had asked in a letter, do you think you could commission a fine American composer or a notable composer to write something for Martha? And she wrote back really cautiously. It's one of the letters from Mrs. Coolidge is in the display cabinets here. But and this next one that she wrote was, and I don't know if we could afford a Copeland or a Hindemith, and in fact, she ended up doing exactly that. But yes, it means budget. It's, you know, who's available. There was a World War II that was brewing, which was another problem in terms of getting who was able, you know, to agree to it. And
Yeah, I think one of the key things just to bear in mind about the entire process is that it doesn't work if the partners are not excited about working together. Ultimately, if you have an institution that wants to commission composer X and choreographer Y, if they are not interested in each other, you're not going to have something that's worth doing, and it probably will fall apart. So there's this kind of dance that happens where everybody's kind of probing. They don't want to say that they really like this one composer if the other person hates it, you know, or that. So this whole process goes about, and eventually things tend to coalesce around a particular partner or things like that. And then of course the greater stature one has, the more weight that opinion tends to have. So they're able to, once you have a commission with Copeland or a Hindemith, or then you're able to work more easily with other composers later too. And so there's other
doors open.
Yeah.
I'll add just one very funny story, I think, about the money aspect of this. So Copeland, I think, was paid $500, I think,
That's right.
says Ms. Shirley, for the commission for this, which, you know, in the 40s was not a small amount, but it also, he could have commanded more with his stature. When the Graham Company performs Appalachian Spring, because the music is copyrighted, we pay a royalty every time through Boozy to the Aaron Copland Fund. And we also, when we do with live music, there's also a rental fee to rent the actual parts. And Boozy, because they understand the popularity of this work and because they have a monopoly, they tend to charge a lot of money for these things. I mean, we're talking something like $300 or $400 per performance for royalty and another $400 for the parts rental. We happened to find about a year ago, I don't know if you know this story, we find a lot of interesting things in our archives and in our warehouse that surface after decades. There was some correspondence between Martha and Aaron, and we have a letter from Copeland that says, well, you know, I know the money's difficult for you, and I'm so glad that you're able to have this piece out there and perform it. And so let's just say between the two of us, $10 a performance in perpetuity. So we took the letter to Boozy. And they had their lawyers look at it very carefully. And the lawyers said, well, yeah, I guess that's it. So we're not getting money back from them, unfortunately. But now we pay them $10 a performance.
I noticed they've been downsized recently. Is it?
Just a follow-on to that. If the library commissioned all of these together, why is there such a...
Okay, that's like a 3-hour discussion. But the short answer is the composer has his own relationship with a publisher. And the copyright to the music travels separate. And it can be arranged differently. A commissioning organization can undertake to own the rights to these things. But in general, and certainly with all the Graham things, the copyright to the music travels differently from the copyright to the dance. That's the very short answer.
And the difference is, like, if you have a work for hire, then the composer gives up those rights, but the library does not do that. So the composer always retains, or the creator of whatever work it is, always retains those rights with certain allowances for, say, broadcast or something like that. So I think at this point, because there's a long night ahead, I'd like to thank our guests, Aaron Scherber and Libby Schmiegel, for joining me and having this very interesting discussion. So if you could join me in thanking them.
Thank you for coming.
Thanks for coming.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.